Dr. Marcus Arvan, thank you for coming on. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jared. I'm glad I could finally arrange a time to do it.
I know. Schedules are crazy. It's been a long time coming, but it's also been great to get to know you over the past few years. I know that that sort of we've been in workshops together and that sort of thing. I think I saw you at the APA, but really good to have an extended conversation with you. I thought that I would start out. I consider you to be sort of the philosophy career guru. And so I wanted to, I'm sure you get not just on your website, which I want to cover, but also just in person and in like correspondence, the question all the time, if someone is thinking about a career in philosophy,
hmm
I know there are many things that you can tell them, but do you even have like sort of this stock response where you go, okay, you're interested in a career in philosophy, you haven't applied to any programs yet. What are the kinds of things that you tell a person?
Oh, that's a great question. So I try to be honest, right? In many ways, it's a incredibly amazing and like privileged existence to be able to think about and talk about and teach, philosophical problems. Like it's what I love to do. I fell in love with it when I was 17 years old, thrown into a philosophy class, and I kind of felt like I knew then that I wanted to do this for a living. And in many ways, it's like everything that I imagined. I mean, I get to think about philosophy for a living, and how cool is that, right? But it was like a really hard road, right? And so in many respects, it was not what I expected or hoped. I struggled to make it through graduate school, and then spent a number of years on the academic job market. Being kept up at night, being unable to sleep because of all the stress. And I was lucky to finally get a permanent job and flourish, but it was definitely a hard road. And so I just try to be honest with anyone who wants to get a higher degree in philosophy that there's no guarantees by any means. And something like half of people who enter into a PhD program finish, and of those who finish, maybe like 40 something percent get a full-time academic job. And I think that good conversations have been had over the years about how to have a plan B so that you don't put all your eggs in the academic job basket. And I think that's awesome. And I've noticed that there seem to be quite a few more philosophers that are going into industry and having good careers too. So that's great to hear. But so like long story short, it's amazing in some ways and has been really hard in other ways. And I just try to be honest with anyone who asks me, like, is this something I should do, to be about, be clear about all of the hurdles there are involved and ways things can go wrong, right? Because, you enter graduate school maybe and you're, as a young person, and life doesn't always go the way you expect in so many ways.
Yeah, that so much of that resonates with me too. And I was going to ask you about the stats along the way of even getting to the point where you have a job offered to you. But maybe if we could start at the beginning. So someone is thinking about applying to a PhD program in philosophy. And I should pause here and just go. So part of it's not the main motivation for me, and I don't want to speak for you to sort of, be the wet blanket on someone's dreams, right? Because I was in the same position. I was in college and I got into this philosophy thing and I was going, well, I can't even believe that this is a major where you can think about things that I'm already thinking about, but in much more depth. And there's an excitement to it. You can understand someone sort of dreaming of like, well, if I could do this for a career,
Mm-hmm.
that would be a dream, of course. And I want to respect that. And then, just as you said, on the other hand, I want to make sure that people have an understanding of the reality of what that means. So,
Mm-hmm.
di in your experience and with all the knowledge that you have answering all kinds of questions about early career philosophers and getting into the field, can you take us through the explanations of why maybe the odds are stacked against people applying to a PhD and then getting through the program and
Mm-hmm.
then actually getting a job on the job market? Why are those odds as low as they are?
Yeah. So I don't know about, it was difficult to get into a PhD program when I applied, but that was a long time ago. And my sense is that more and more people with excellent grades, and we know how, grades have risen over time, right? Like really excellent grades and backgrounds, and people now have access to all the information on the internet. So are probably much more well educated philosophically than I was at a similar amount of time. There's just a ton of competition, right? I don't know exactly how many people apply to PhD programs, but the incoming cohorts, right, are something like maybe 5 or 6 or 7 students. And so if you have well over 100 applicants, that's less than 10% of applicants that are getting in. I mean, I applied to PhD programs in the late 90s. And then I think I applied 2 years in a row because I didn't get into programs I wanted to the first time. But even the year that I got in, I think I applied to 23 programs and I got into 2. And the 2 programs that I got into were, I guess, more lowly ranked than I expected. I mean, they were decent, but, I had been hoping to get into a highly ranked program. And I eventually ended up transferring later for some interesting reasons and unexpected reasons into a more highly ranked program, and that had all kinds of unexpected implications for my career as well. But like that's the short story about like why I think it's so difficult to get into a program. But then like once you're in a graduate program, that's when things get really difficult, right? Because you're not only engaging at a much higher level with philosophy than you were before, but there is this roadblock that a lot of people fall into that I know I fell into and I saw other students in my PhD program fall into, which is like coming up with a viable and good dissertation topic, right? So like most students that I think make their way into a good PhD program have a little problem getting through the coursework, and you've got like 2 or 3 years of coursework, but then you got to come up with like a big project, right? And you're doing something for the first time that isn't just a term paper for a class where you have all the readings provided for you and you've got to like write one response to a reading. You've got to come up with like a set of 3 to 5 related papers, or in my case I wrote a traditional book type dissertation, and that's really tough to do. I spent probably 2 years trying to come up with a viable dissertation. I had my first dissertation proposal sort of rejected, or they didn't even decide to have a discussion about it at the last moment. So then I had to come up with something entirely new. And then meanwhile, you're a young person and it can be incredibly frustrating. And so for me, I started spending a lot of time hanging with friends, playing video games and playing music. And then all of a sudden I found I wasn't spending much time doing philosophy and much time around the department. And I saw a number of other students sort of do the same thing. They sort of like fell away out of just sort of discouragement. And I was lucky enough to finally sort of get my act together at the last moment, come up luckily with a dissertation topic, though I did get some good advice for how to do that really did help. And that's a fun little story. But look, I barely made it by the skin of my teeth. Like there were many times that I thought I was never going to make it through and get the doctorate. I thought I was going to have spent the better part of a decade in a graduate program and be a dropout and have no career prospects because I didn't have a plan B. So that's tough, right? And so, I knew students that, didn't make it through or sort of fell by the wayside. And I came very close to doing that. And so, like I said, I don't know the exact statistics, but it's something like only 50% or something that enter a grad program finish. And then when you get out, there's hundreds of applicants for every permanent philosophy job. And, they've all published well. And, publishing itself is a very difficult thing. And I didn't really know how to do it as a graduate student. I screwed up a couple of close calls where I almost got something published but didn't. And then I spent my first few years after graduate school learning how to publish very slowly initially and then getting better at it. But you're competing again against hundreds of people who are all coming from amazing programs. They're all really brilliant people and they've all accomplished a lot. And you're competing for a very small number of jobs. And then, some people are lucky to find themselves with a permanent job. It took me over 7 years on the market, right? I was fortunate to have a decently paying full-time job so I could last that long, but I was literally on my last year of the full-time job when I finally was able to get a tenure track permanent job. And if I hadn't, I probably wouldn't be here today. I'd probably be out in industry doing something else God knows what, because I didn't have any other marketable skills really. So that's my story, and that's kind of my story about how why it's such a fraught road.
Yeah, and so from start to finish, how many years, like from when you first applied to a program? Because I was in the same boat. I applied for one round and I didn't get in anyway. I got into a master's program and that wouldn't work out. It wasn't funded. And then I had to re-up for the next year and apply. And fortunately, I got into a program. But from the time that you started applying to programs
Mhm.
to the time that you got an academic tenure track position,
Mhm.
how many years would that have been?
17 years.
17 years. Okay. So that, I don't know how typical that timeline is. I wouldn't describe it as completely atypical,
Yeah.
but it certainly isn't the path that you probably thought you were getting on at the beginning of the process.
Hmm.
And you said, so can you take us through like the psychology of like when you were in that program,
Hmm.
would you characterize as like the most difficult part the psychological, or was it the academic? Was it a combination? Was it the financial? I'm sure all of those factors were at play, but at least in my experience, it seems like if a student is going to drop out, a lot of the times it is because of the psychological.
Yes. Yes. So it was definitely, I mean, it was partly the academic, right? Coming up with a viable dissertation topic was something that I felt completely unprepared for. And I got incredibly discouraged. And like many people, I started to get really sort of anxious about how my career was going, whether I would finish, got really down about it. And then I turned to things in my life that made me feel better, right? Hanging out with friends, playing video games, and playing and recording music. And I saw a lot of other people find hobbies, right? Like I had a friend who made beer on the side, right? And, other friends who did other things. And it was like the amount of stress that you're under because you realize that you've spent a number of years doing this. And if you don't succeed, that what are you going to do? It can weigh on you really heavily. And then you can make, especially as a young person who's still trying to figure things out, you can make some quote unquote bad decisions, right? Not focusing enough on your academics because you're so discouraged by it. And that can, start out with a few weeks and turn into months and then to a few years. And finally you find yourself not having much to show for your years in graduate school. And so it was very much the psychological aspect. I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners know that there have been all these studies that show that like mental illness diagnoses are far higher among graduate students than in the general population. And of course, there's ongoing debate about the nature of mental illness and whether it's and what to extent it's biological versus a matter of social circumstances. But my experience was that it was very hard psychologically, and that was a real hurdle to make it through graduate school successfully as a young person, right? Because I did not feel equipped to deal with those psychological issues in conjunction with the very difficult nature of the academics at a critical juncture, which again for me was the dissertation stage. And again, for a lot of people I knew, that was the critical juncture as well.
Yeah. So that's the program part. Now, I'm not on a tenure track, but I know enough to know that that can also be an extremely stressful time. I have one professor in mind where after going through the process, it was like just this, well, it was all kinds of emotions, but he expressed to me just how incredibly intense those years were. And typically, I guess it's about 6 years or so. So, how do you compare the stress from being in a graduate program to the stress of being in the tenure track position when you don't have tenure yet? And can
Mm-hmm.
you describe that process a little bit for people who don't understand? Like, let's say that
Sure,
you
sure.
have that dream position, and that's great, but there's still a lot more to do, and there's a lot of pressure involved.
Well, I think a lot depends on your circumstance, the kind of institution you're at, and then where you are in your career by the time you have that tenure track position. So for me, the tenure track position actually wasn't that stressful. And the reason it wasn't that stressful, there's actually a couple reasons. So first is like the type of institution that I'm at, right? Which is, it's increasingly moving in a research direction. But my university has traditionally been considered, a liberal arts university where there's a predominant focus on teaching. And um, so I've known people who have had tenure track jobs at like R1 or like top notch research universities where if I had been in one of those positions, I would have been stressed out to no end because I've known people that have had incredible publishing records at an R1 and then were denied tenure, right? Because they really have to meet the highest level of research expectations, right? And it's sometimes even unclear what those levels are. Is it publishing 6 articles in a top journal? And some universities, that's not even enough. Like you have to be considered one of the top people in your field and get recommendation letters from other people saying that to get tenure. And so, if I were in one of those positions, I would have been stressed out as a tenure track faculty. Now, again, I was at a university where there was a greater focus on teaching, but I also, as I mentioned before, only got the position after 7 years on the job market in a full-time but non-tenure track position. And so it was really during those 7 years that I went through all of the stress because I hadn't published much. And so I had to learn how to be, how to balance a pretty high teaching load with service expectations and then being able to publish consistently. And so that period of my life when I was learning how to do those things and finally like learning how to publish articles on a consistent basis, that was incredibly stressful. And if I had gotten a job right out of a tenure track job right out of graduate school, that would have been the period of my life where I would have had to figure all that stuff out. And so, yeah, if that had been my story, then I would have been incredibly stressed in my job because when I got my initial job, I hadn't published anything. And it took a lot of trial and error and figuring things out to learn how to publish. But by the time I finally got the tenure track position after 7 years, I had published quite a bit. I had a pretty strong teaching record. And so I finally felt once I got the job pretty comfortable that I would probably get tenure 6 years later, which actually, no, they gave me a couple years toward tenure. So it was 4 years later that I got tenure. By that time, I felt pretty confident. But so again, I think it depends a lot on your situation and the type of institution you're at.
Yeah, and typically when someone doesn't get tenure, what typically happens to their
Yeah.
career?
I wish I had a good answer to that question. I mean, I know what technically happens, which is they're usually given one more year on the job that they're at so they can hopefully find something else. Um, and then they go on the job market that year. They can go back on the academic job market. And depending on what kind of institution you're at, it's possible that you might be able to get a tenure track job somewhere else. In fact, I have a friend who did that. They were at an R1. They had a great publishing record, but they didn't get tenure. And then they applied for other jobs and they got a job at a kind of a university that focuses more on teaching, right? But I suspect for quite a few people, if you don't get tenure, you have that one more year, and you may have to leave academia if you can't find something permanent, or move into a part-time adjuncting role. Unfortunately,
Yeah. So one of my questions, in your opinion, I've thought a lot about what the academic process filters for and the kinds of people who sort of make it through, or let's say have the best odds of getting through. And as I look at it, it is, and so this is not, I'm not going to make a comment on the actual existing profession, but I'm speculating on, well, what do you have to sort of like have to get through this? And one of it is maybe some independent funding, because if you're going through all of this and you don't get a tenure track job and you have some other kind of job, but you want to go for a tenure track job later,
mm-hmm.
there's a lot of financial hurdles that you have to cross both in grad school and then
Yep.
afterwards if you don't immediately do that. So maybe there's some sort of like independent funding going on. There's also, I would say, it seems to me, sort of a kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
And that's someone who is okay with like a solitary life. Maybe they have a family, maybe they don't. And I've written on this the challenges of having a family while you're in grad school and going through that tenure
Hmm.
process. And you have to sacrifice, no matter what your family situation is, you have to sacrifice a great deal. And
Yes.
not everyone is sort of like cut out for that.
Yes.
So it seems to kind of filter out people who might be family oriented or just have a family and come with that perspective. I guess my question is, I've thought a lot about like what does that do to the philosophy profession if it's filtered, if all these hurdles are in the way,
Hmm.
where it does sort of lend itself to a solitary person, someone at least at the research level, someone who is maybe not as, I don't know, socially engaged and maybe comes from a financial background and maybe doesn't have a family. I know that's a really broad question, but
Hmm.
as I have been taking a wider scope look at the profession, it does seem to track a little bit with
Yeah.
some of the trends. I don't know if you have any comments on that or
Yeah.
if you're even able to speak to that.
No, I think both of those. I mean, I think there are so many reasons why people, either quote unquote succeed in the profession or don't. A lot of it is luck, right? I mean, I didn't have extra independent funding, and I'll just be honest. If I hadn't been lucky enough to find a full time job where I had like they could keep me on up to 7 years. If I had found myself in an adjuncting position, I would have left very quickly because I couldn't. My family, my wife and I couldn't live with that kind of income and lack of like healthcare and all that kind of stuff, right? So for me, it was partly a matter of luck. I lucked out and got a full time job that was renewable for some number of years that enabled me to stay on the market long enough, just long enough, right, to luck out and get a tenure track job. But I will say that, like, during those 7 years that I was on the market, I think at one point I posted about this on the Cocoon, but like, my wife and I were watching the film Zero Dark 30 by Catherine Bigelow on, the search for Osama bin Laden. And there's this scene where the woman investigator meets with the head of the CIA, and he asks, "What have you been doing other than this, right, in your time here at the CIA, other than tracking bin Laden?" She says, "Nothing. I have done nothing else." And that's what the job market was for me. I very much lived that solitary life. I did nothing else other than preparing teaching, grading, trying to publish, and then have a few hours at night with my spouse and on the weekends. And I tried to have at least some semblance of work-life balance. Like I learned early on not to work on the weekends and not to work in the evenings, that I at least owed my spouse that, like, time with her, that, not dedicated to the job market. But I didn't have time for things like, friendships and, you know, hobbies, right? I took on hobbies only after getting tenure. I went back to doing some music, but that was only after setting it aside for, over a decade. And, I think you're absolutely right. So what does that say about the profession? I mean, it sucks, right? It sucks. That's been the hardest part, for me and my wife and I. We put off having a family for a long time, in part because things were so uncertain for such a long period of time. And um, I don't know what's to be done about it, right? It's just the academy is set up to be incredibly difficult. And I will say, so my wife worked in a different academic field and left for work in industry, for a variety of reasons. But she'll say even in her own field, most faculty, virtually no faculty, have kids, right? And one thing you touched on, I don't think it's just this way at research universities, right? And in many ways, I've thought that my job at the university that I'm at is probably a lot more work than a job at a research university, because you don't have to spend, at least so I hear, a ton of time on teaching at an R1. You can, you have like a low teaching load, maybe one or two classes a semester, and you get to spend all your other time reading and writing articles. For me, I spend the vast majority of my time during the semester teaching, and maybe an hour here or there to work on research. But then the only time I can really do research is during the summer. And so you hear that academics have the summers off. I mean, that hasn't been the case for me either. I've spent virtually every summer working most of the time. And, I'm trying to take a little bit more time away looking forward, just because we now do have a child, and I want to be good and be present as a father and as a husband. And try to finally forge those aspects of a good, well-rounded life that I haven't been able to do for so much of my career.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's really helpful. And there's so many things that I want to respond to there. One of which is, so you mentioned the cocoon. You started this amazing website, the Philosopher's Cocoon, and I have to think, correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of your personal experience and trials and challenges was at least part of the motivation for starting this thing so that you could help others
Mhm.
and maybe inform them in ways that either you weren't or you wish that others were. So, can you take us through where did that idea come from and what was sort of the origin story of this website that, again, I consider to be, it was like my, when I was in grad school, it was like my philosophy Bible career wise. I was on that site every single day. I mean, this was years ago, but was just unbelievably appreciative
Mhm.
of it existing in the first place. And I'm telling you, like, it was a major part of me going through the program at all because I realized, okay, there are other people going through what I'm going through. There are other people thinking the same thoughts about how difficult this is. There's advice. And so it steered me in the right directions. But enough about me. I want to hear what was the thought when you wanted to start this pretty big project?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for. I'm glad that I'm so gratified that it proved to be so helpful to you, and that's really cool to hear. So let's see. So I wrote once on the cocoon that a lot of people might not expect this, given that it's such a public endeavor, but I'm an extremely shy and introverted person, right? And so when I was in graduate school and I was struggling, I isolated myself from others, right? I didn't feel comfortable sort of going to other graduate students, right? Because I felt, in, uh, I just, I had a lot of self doubt, and I wasn't comfortable really going to faculty either because I didn't want to be sort of judged for all the struggles that I was facing. I didn't even really want them to know. Although at one point I did ask for help, and it proved to be a sort of career. Um, uh, it really helped me finally make it through the end. But long story short, I felt extremely alone and isolated, and I sort of sensed that there were other students that felt the same way, right? That were struggling and that just sort of faded into the background. And um, I really, wished that there was some place to get some advice that would in some way be safe, where you wouldn't, feel judged for asking questions that you might think are stupid, or for coming forward with some kind of struggle and trying to work through it. And there wasn't anything like that in the profession. There was like one sort of web page that I think was run by graduate students called the Philosophy Smoker, which focused on the job market. But it was like a very toxic place, and there were sort of rumor mongering and all kinds of stuff that I really didn't like. And I just wanted to, I don't know, it was just a shot in the dark. I remember sort of initially launching the site and asking a couple of friends in the profession, what do you think about this? And they're like, I think it's probably a waste of time. And I just started blogging about the things that I was struggling with and asking questions. And then people started to latch on, and just used it to work through a lot of my own struggles, and then initially, and increasingly tried to bring in other people to bring their voices to the project, and it just kind of went and flourished. It's funny, you said earlier that I'm like something of like a I don't know, guru of something like that. And one of the interesting things is I used to blog. I used to write a lot more on the blog myself, and a lot of readers might have noticed. Now I for the most part just post readers' queries for open discussion, because one of the things I think I've learned in my career is that, like, I really don't have all the answers, and there are so many different perspectives on every single issue that one can raise. I think the best thing, at least my sense is, and that's why that the blog has sort of gone in that direction, is to just let people raise their struggles or questions, and then have a forum where people can, in a supportive manner, discuss them, and so they can see how other people in the profession, including people on search committees, think about things. And a lot of times you see, well, people on search committees think about the same issue in dramatically different ways, but at least that's helpful information, right? And that's really been my hope, and you know, I hope it served people well. It definitely served me well, because again, it did help me through the market through some very difficult times.
Yeah, well, I think that's really helpful. And part of the reason I, mentioned I consider you to be kind of the guru, well, a number of reasons, but also, I'm not sure of another person who has as much data accumulated over as many years as you've been running the site. I forget how many years. I'd like to know that too. But the amount of questions that you get and the comments that you get, and again, sort of the data that you're seeing, I don't know of another spot where someone can, well, from your perspective, take a look at the profession as a whole and have that vast of an understanding over that many years. And there's a sense in which, you again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost as if for some of these questions you have to play the role of like therapist and counselor to some of these people. And maybe that's a lead into the question of like what's been some of the emotionally difficult parts of watching people go through the academic process. Has that either, I know that there are joys to the website as well, I want to talk about those, but has it been difficult as well, just hearing the stories that come out of it?
Yeah, I mean, of course it is. I remember when I was there, and you feel like you've accomplished a lot and you've published a lot, and there's a lot of like, why am I not getting interviews? Why am I not getting flyouts? What am I doing wrong? And the thing that you learn, especially when you've been on the other side, is like you're not doing anything wrong. It's just there's so many good people out there who do amazing work and have accomplished so much, and there's just not enough jobs out there. And my heart goes out to everyone who's struggling on the market, because it's this sort of, it can seem like this impenetrable, confounding thing where why does someone get a job and another person don't? Why does one person get an interview and another person doesn't? And there's, as you see in the discussions, there's innumerable reasons. I mean, I've ceased being surprised or shocked about the ways that a search committee member, different search committee members can think about the very same thing. One person will think, oh, that's a total mistake to do that on the job market. And another person will think, no, you should do exactly that on the job market. And I have some thoughts about like what to take away from the fact that you constantly get conflicting advice. But that's one of the things you learn, right? And I think that is one thing, hopefully, that the site has been good for, is just to see things that you might have thought that there was a clear answer to, that no, people, in positions of power and not in positions of power throughout the profession systematically disagree about virtually everything, much as in philosophy, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And my initial thought is, so I want to hear your thoughts on the conflicting advice, but one of my thoughts is that like you said, that the huge aspect of luck.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when you're on the other side of it, it seems like an arbitrariness to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that, if there was a way to go, well, look, you take these steps and then you have a pretty good shot at getting a job,
Mm-hmm.
then I think a lot of people would go, okay, I accept that difficulty and that challenge. That's fine. But the arbitrary nature of it just makes you think, I'm just going through the motions and doing everything to the best of my ability. And knowing that any sort of, committee member viewing things one way and not the other, or maybe they're in a bad mood, or like whatever it is, the social dynamic of that particular meeting that morning when they're going through applicants and what happened that week, there are all these uncontrollable factors. And
Yeah.
to me, that was at least a huge part of just going, how can I not just like throw up my hands and just go, what is the use? If it's just arbitrary, what am I
Yeah.
doing? But I'm interested in your conflicting advice thoughts.
Yeah, so I think on some issues you see some trends, right? So there'll always be outliers. There'll always be like one. I remember when I started the blog. I mean, I had some people tell me like, "This is a mistake. This will be really bad for your career. It will make you look poorly." And I can't even count the number of times that I was on like an on-campus interview where I had search committee members say, "Oh, you have this amazing blog. Like, let's talk about it." And I don't know how many people would have said it's a good idea to create a blog, but I certainly knew there were some that thought it was a terrible idea. And yet I did it anyway, right? Because it was something that I valued and that I wanted to do. And so, I think that the best that anyone can do is you do your best work as, as a researcher, and do work that you enjoy and teach to the best of your ability and try to teach in ways that you find valuable and enjoying. And then look at all the information that you get and see if there are any trends about like what search committees tend to think about a particular thing, like whether it's okay to list like works in progress in your CV or not. And it seems like most of them think it's okay. Then so like do that, but like otherwise, right? You got to kind of just, it's kind of like playing poker. You got to place your bets, play the best game you can, um, and unfortunately, you have to realize that there are a lot of luck and variables that can't be solved for, like in mathematics. And that's really the best that you can do is just take the information you get, place your bets on where you think that information points, and do your best work. And you have to, for better or worse, right? Play the cards you have and see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. One of the questions that I had for you, can you help me understand how you have thought of, let's just say, the relatively low income ceiling of a philosopher, a philosophy professor? Um, and I say that because we have talked about all the challenges and all the years and the struggle that it takes to
Mm-hmm.
get to some sort of position, full-time position, whether that be tenure track, permanent, whatever it is, takes a long time and a lot of struggle. And at the end of it, look, the salary range is pretty vast, I'm sure, depending on if you're R1 or
Mm-hmm.
on down. And I know I just looked up at one school, there are some philosophy professors making like $250,000. That is extremely rare. But
Mm-hmm.
the average, I don't know what the average is, but relatively speaking,
Mm-hmm.
to the amount of effort and years and challenges you have to overcome, it's not a whole lot. So, how have
Mm-hmm.
you thought about the even ethics of a philosophy professor's salary?
That's a very difficult question. So, I mean, I do think there's a lot of variance in salaries for full time and tenure track faculty. I've been stunned at how low some of the salaries can be at certain places. And as you mentioned, there can be quite good salaries at other places. And so my sense is there's a lot of variance. And I don't think a lot of people are maybe all that well aware of it. I know I certainly wasn't as a job candidate. Um, what are the ethics about? I mean, what are the ethics of the entire profession, right? I mean, most instructors are adjunct faculty who don't have full-time salaries or benefits at all. I mean, to me, that's the real the real scandal. I mean, you know, if salaries weren't that awesome, but the vast majority of people were able to get a permanent position and have healthcare and benefits, and we one thing I do think that needs to be taken into account, at least with respect to the ethics of it and as compensation, is I do think one of the best, or at least for me, best aspects of being an academic is time, right? I do have close to 4 months away from teaching duties in the summer, and a month or so at winter break. And you know some people will say, and I think I agree, that like time is really all we have in this life, right? And I will say, even on those times, I think I've spent way too much time focusing on research and professional things, and I'm trying to carve out a more balanced life, like I said. But that is an aspect of compensation, because we are in effect being paid, to only be in the classroom something like 7 to 8 months a year. And at least if you have a full-time job, that's, even if the salary is low, I mean, that's a pretty good aspect of compensation. And again, but that doesn't mean to say that I think the low compensation is a good thing, morally speaking. I'm one of these people that unfortunately is like, it is what it is. What am I going to do about it? I'm not on a board of trustees somewhere who decide, or a upper administrator who decides what salaries are. And I just, again, you have to decide: is this a profession that I want to go into? And if it is, what can I do to try to make things a little bit better? I mean, that's been my, with the blog and everything else. What can I do, reasonably speaking, to make things a little bit better? Um, and who knows where my career or anyone's career will go from here. Are there ways that some point down the road I'll be able to help improve people's salaries? I don't know. Hopefully, that'd be great. But it's a hard nut to crack.
Yeah, my thought, I'm of two minds. I know that the market is the market.
Yeah.
And look, there's a lot of PhDs, as you mentioned, who are entering the job market. In your mind, what about the scenario where institutions just admitted smaller cohorts on the whole? Would that lead to better consequences, or in your mind, how would that affect the market?
That's a good question. I think just, I guess my sense is, I'm not sure, but I think it would. I suspect it would be a good idea, and I'd like to see graduate departments really ensure that all of their graduates, or virtually all of their graduates, can get good gainful employment by the time they're finished. I know that's not how it is in philosophy, but that's how it was in my spouse's field. Though, of course, my spouse worked in an applied field where they can get jobs quite easily outside of academia. But they place something like 100% of their graduates in good, well-paying, full-time jobs, and that, I think, is what our profession should shoot for, because a lot of us have been there. You've spent 5 or 6 years in a grad program. You feel like you're about to fail out because you haven't got maybe enough mentorship with respect to publishing or whatnot, and there are not enough jobs. And the sunk cost, I know, can be really like devastating. I mean, you can start graduate school like I did at 22 and find yourself in your sort of mid 30s with no savings, no, real stability in your career. And to me, that's it was a hard thing to face. And I don't think that any young person who makes a decision at 22 should be in that position a decade later. That a really good profession should really focus its resources on making sure that the people who enter it are in a good position to succeed in a way that would make them happy in their careers. Um, Again, I know things are difficult in the humanities, but I think that's at least a good ideal to aim for.
I know that in your academic work, you have brought in well, what's the way to ask this? There is an element of scientific research in your work as well. And I'm curious, how did that start? Was that an interest that was always there? And was there sort of like a motivation for bringing in scientific research to the philosophy context? And yeah, I'm interested in your personal history regarding that and some of the motivation for doing it.
Sure. No, thanks. So I did my undergraduate degree under Dan Dennett. He was my advisor. And so Dan Dennett was, of course, big into cognitive science and evolutionary biology, and was sort of a polymath in so many ways. And so I had a lot of interesting discussions with him as an undergrad, and he was not at all satisfied with the philosophy profession, in particular, the kinds of methods used in philosophy, right? And I've explored some of that in my own work, which is, you can reason rigorously, but if your data is bad, it's so-called garbage in, garbage out. And, if you're basing philosophy on, sort of your intuitions or the intuitions of people who agree with you, those intuitions they may be true or may be accurate or reliable, and they may not be, particularly if there's people with very different intuitions. And as a philosopher, I've always thought, like, what's the point of this? Some people think the point of philosophy is understanding, but I think most of us want to know the truth. Like, what is the truth about right and wrong, morality? What's the truth about, you know, material coincidence when it comes to metaphysics or whatever? And so I got into philosophy because I was interested in the problems and I wanted to know the answers. And then it seemed to me, through my discussions with Dan and subsequently that it didn't seem to me like philosophy had really great answers. And so well, why has science been so successful? It's because they use rigorous methods of what constitutes evidence and data that needs to be repeatable and observed, right? Not just by one person or their friends, right? But and so I've always thought science can provide a firmer evidential basis for philosophical reasoning. And so for that reason, I've sort of defended it methodologically and tried to pursue those avenues. And it's not that I think that philosophical speculation is necessarily bad, but that insofar as we're interested in true answers to questions, we need to recognize the real limitations of traditional philosophical methods, and that insofar as science holds itself to more rigorous evidential standards, that we should try to see the ways in which science can illuminate answers to philosophical questions in ways that we can sort of show a clear tether to reality outside of us.
I think that's so helpful. So that's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, especially in my teaching role. What do I communicate to students regarding what is this thing called philosophy and what can you expect from it? And I don't know. Maybe I don't know if this view is sympathetic to what you said or not, but I've been thinking, philosophy, like you said, initially I thought, okay, well, this is the field to go to if you want truth and if you want answers to the big questions, let's say. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a part of me that still thinks that in some ways, but I've had to adjust my thinking and going, well, maybe the biggest value of philosophy is more sort of like methodological in evaluating arguments and that sort of thing, and not coming up with particular conclusions, but almost showing you how to make those arguments, etc., and not in every case providing quote unquote the correct answer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that sort of how you see it, or would you
Yeah.
adjust that in some way?
Well, so I think there's value to that, right? And one thing I think to take away from it, right? I mean, of course, Socrates said the only thing I learned from doing philosophy is that I don't know anything, because there are all these arguments that go in different directions for any issue in question. There's arguments for physicalism about consciousness. There's arguments for anti-physicalism, and so on and so forth. And so, better understanding the arguments, I think it has value. It leads to understanding about the case to be made for one position and the case to be made for another. But to me, like, that's good, but that's not all we should want, right, out of philosophy. Like, I think most of us got into it because we wanted answers, and wanted to believe that some answers are more supported by evidence than others. And to me, if we want to move beyond understanding the arguments and the different directions they lie, and try to find some determinate truth of the matter, it's really there that bringing in a scientific perspective can be helpful. And I realize there's a lot of disagreement about whether that can be done, or whether it turns, quote unquote, philosophy into nothing more than science. But that's my general thought. It's like, I think both things are valuable, but I think a lot of traditional philosophers want to say, well, the science is irrelevant. That's not really philosophy. And I think that it is. I think there's a place for naturalistic philosophy, and there's a place for the other kind, and that both should be done, right? They can both do different things.
Yeah, I'm interested in how you understand that perspective related to the classroom, because
Mm.
the way that I approach teaching students in the classroom is that, and again, I'll be interested to hear if you agree, disagree. I know other people have different pedagogical perspectives on this, but at least my approach is there is this power dynamic going on with professor and students in such a way that I don't want to ever give the impression that I am trying to persuade the students on a particular position. I more want to show the students the different kinds of arguments that are out there, and
Mm-hmm.
let them sort of come to their own conclusions given all the good arguments that hopefully I have steel manned along the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
That's my pedagogical perspective. How do you approach that in the classroom?
This is something that I've always been uncertain about in my career. early in my career, I actually had this explicitly worked into my syllabus. Is like, I'm going to tell you what I think, but don't think you should agree with me, right? Like, one of the things that I found so exciting as an undergrad taking classes from Dan Dennett was that he was always very clear about what he thought. In fact, he rarely actually lectured on the things that we read. He would just come in and lecture on something else, and then we'd sort of discuss it all together in conjunction with what we did read. And it was sort of fascinating, and I'd argue with him, and other students would argue with him. So I thought that was really cool. But one of the things that I think I did notice over the course of my career, both in graduate school and then as a teacher, is like there's always going to be some students that even if you say, hey, don't tell me what you think I want to hear, that they'll do it because they want the grade, right? And so in later years, I sort of moved away from that and done more along the lines of what you're saying, which is saying like, here, I'm going to steel man all the arguments, including the ones that I disagree with, and don't think that you can sort out what you think my views are. Although if people ever find my website, right, they might be able to figure out what my views are. And there's nothing I can really do to prevent that because my work is out there. But that's what I try to do. For the reasons that you give, is I don't want students to tell me what they think I want to hear. I want them to sincerely think about the arguments on their own merits. And it's funny, when I teach courses on justice, I swear, like, all of my students think that when I teach like libertarianism, they all think I'm a libertarian. And then when I teach egalitarianism, they all think I'm an egalitarian. And when I teach communism, they all think I'm a communist, because I'm trying to give the best arguments, right? Or hold them up in the best light possible. And again, we learn early on in our education, right? Like the principle of charity is you should always present the best version of your opponent's argument possible. And that's something that, in my experience, students find very foreign to them, right? That you should try to present the strongest case for the view that you disagree with. And so I think there's great value in that. But this is an issue I've always sort of waffled on. I don't know what the best way is.
And that makes sense to me. And students could always go to your publication record as well and go, oh, well, he's written a few books and he's written articles that argue for particular positions. And I think that's obviously perfectly, a good thing. I do want to talk about your publication record and all the work that you have produced academically. We've talked about some of the challenges of just going through the academic process and getting hired and that sort of thing,
Mhm.
but haven't really spent a lot of time on the difficulties of publishing and producing. And look, I know, given your comments earlier, but I just want to say it is on any measure an extremely impressive publication record over the past few years. Good journals, great articles, some co-authoring going on, books, etc. So, what do I know? But at least from my perspective, I'm looking at it going, "Wow, well done." Can you talk about how have you approached your academic productivity, including your motivation? Because after tenure, well, maybe we can talk about that. Like what the motivation is after getting tenure, what maybe the either official or unofficial requirements are
Mhm.
for continuing to publish in either your department or similar departments, other departments. So lot going on there, but I'm interested in like how you have approached producing and publishing at that rate, beginning with your sort of early career
Sure.
publications.
So I'll tell you a fun story. Um, so, like I said, in graduate school, I was not successful publishing. Right, I had a couple pieces that got relatively close to ending up in good journals, but then I completely botched the revise and resubmits with them because I didn't actually get any help with them. Like I didn't sort of run past my revisions, past my advisor, because I was too sort of insecure about it, and so I sent them off, and I screwed things up. And then I got my first job, which was like a 1 year job, and I didn't have any publications. And so I tried following all the advice that I had like been given throughout graduate school from people, which is like, read the literature, find a little problem, make like one little tiny, contribution on that argument. And I tried writing these papers for like a year in that job, and it was just miserable. I'd spend months and months and months on this little paper. I was completely like unenthused by it. And I still didn't publish anything because the work wasn't that great. And it was kind of like this miserable experience. So after that 1 year, I did publish like a couple page reply article to something, but that was it. And then I moved to a job in the States, which again was a 1 year job that was like renewable for up to 7 years. And I sort of kept doing the same thing. So I'd spend months and months trying to write a single article. And I had a couple articles after like my first year or something that were out there. And, or I was just about close to being finished with them. And then this was before like the era of like Google Drive and like online, cloud computing. And I didn't have, a backup drive. I lost all my work. My hard drive on my laptop died. And I'd spent months and months on a couple of articles and I still hadn't published anything. And honestly, at that point, I wanted to give up, right? There was the whole like trying to get, send it off the drive to, a computer analyst to see if they could get any information off of it. They couldn't get anything off of it. And so I really, at that point, was like, I'm just going to give up. Like, I can't do this. But I decided not to give up. And so I tried to rewrite everything as quickly as I possibly could out of my head from what I remembered that I wrote. And I did it really, really quickly, right? I was able to like rewrite the papers in like a couple days each. And I was like, wow, like if you really, you can write quickly, right? You don't have to spend months and months on an article. And so what I did after that, because I was sort of unenthused about the little tiny, reading all of the literature and coming up with a little tiny response, is I finally just started writing up every idea that I had as quickly as I possibly could that I thought was at all interesting. And I found it to be really fun. And I'd have like, a dozen different drafts of papers here and there, not based on like scanning the literature, but just like things about the world that occurred to me. And I'd write them up and then I'd see like whether someone had defended that idea. And it turned out like maybe no one had, or maybe my idea was slightly different than something that someone else had published. But like, I had a fantastic time doing it. I enjoyed philosophy for like the first time in years. And I just started sending things out. And then like the more things I had out, someone told me that like, well, if, rejection rates are 90%, then you basically have to have 10 things out at any particular point in time to get an acceptance. So, well, I was having fun. I was writing tons of papers. And so I just sent them all out and I would start getting, 9 rejections, but for every 9 rejections, I get 1 acceptance. And then, as years went along, if I wrote 10 papers 1 year and I wrote 10 papers the next year, then I'd have 20 papers to send out, right? Some of them I would learn pretty quickly through the peer review process were garbage, and so I wouldn't send those out anymore, but I'd send out the ones that I got pretty good comments on. And so I just started publishing that way. So it was kind of this horrible accident of my hard drive dying and my deciding, hey, I can write things quickly and I'm just going to write stuff that I find to be interesting and forget about all the things I was told I was supposed to do. And it kind of worked out, which is weird. It's not what I expected, because I didn't do what people who told me, here's how you publish research, this is what you should be doing. I didn't do that. I just tried to enjoy doing philosophy, and it worked out. So that's at one point in the job market, I sort of decided, like, if I'm going to fail at this, I want to fail doing philosophy in a way that is true to who I am and what I find to be interesting, and not just what I'm quote unquote supposed to be doing. Because I never got in philosophy to like make that little tiny contribution to that little tiny debate on that one little tiny article. It was like Kant and, the big works that interested me. And of course, I don't pretend to be on anything like that level, but like, that's what I was interested in. And so it's like, if that's what made you fall in love with philosophy, do that and let the cards fall where they may. And so like, when it comes to like why I do research after getting tenure, it's because I love philosophy. Like the thing I'm really grateful for is I love doing it as much as I did when I was a 17-year-old showing up in the classroom for the first time. Like, it's just, I find it fascinating. I love thinking about it. I love writing on it. The stuff that I don't like is all of the rejections and, all that stuff, the professional aspects. But, that's just kind of what you have to deal with to make your way in this profession.
I think that's so interesting that after this many years and with a publication record that you have, the rejections still get to you.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, like, and they happen to everyone. I've heard from, Jason Stanley once wrote something that I shared on the Cocoon, and he's a top research university. Is like, and I've heard this from other people too, is that they constantly get rejected, and a lot of them will say, I don't even send stuff to journals anymore. I only publish stuff in edited volumes because I don't want to get rejected all the time, right? Um, but yeah, no, it totally gets to you because you still have people. This is a fun little story. So in my wife's field, which is industrial psychology, organizational psychology, her graduate advisor was like one of the most famous people in their entire profession, right? Like he, every textbook is like, he's got entire sections devoted to him, right? And he once shared with her, and I think with me too, he would get rejections from journals saying like this must have been done by a graduate student, right? Just like totally dismissive, like, this person's terrible, their work is terrible, this is the most famous person in your entire field. And I know that happens to philosophers too. It sucks. It will happen as long as you're trying to send stuff to peer review. And honestly, you have to try to ignore it and just move on. And I'll say it doesn't really get easier, right? It's great that my life doesn't, or my career doesn't hang on the balance of it anymore, like it did when I was on the job market, but it still sucks. Like every time someone's like, your paper's horrible, and you don't even know what an argument is.
Yeah, I thought it was so encouraging your comments on motivation because just the fact that you are internally motivated to explore these interests and topics and curiosities that come from you, and that's the genesis of the papers. I think that's so helpful for people who might just be starting out, where if that motivation isn't there, then typically the work is going to suffer a bit. Just the way that works out. I got a question just either yesterday, but this week on someone, they're trying to find a dissertation topic.
Mhm.
And it's encouraging to hear you say that, because my advice was, you got to find something that motivates you. Otherwise, it just won't last in the long run. You have to find that sort of internal, because if you're just doing it out of like you said, I'm supposed to, this is my
Mhm.
duty, this is what the academy maybe wants to hear, that just doesn't seem sustainable for the long term. And it seems like that you're a case in point that has carried you over decades, it seems.
100%. That, I think, made every difference in my well-being and in terms of my productivity in my career. It was that shift from doing it for the sake of the external rewards to like throwing up my hands and saying, I don't really have control over that. I just want to do work I enjoy. And that made not only my life happier in doing work, but made me much more productive because I enjoyed actually doing the work for the first time in a long time. And my wife, working in a different field, would say exactly the same thing. Like, if you don't have that internal motivation, if that's not like the sort of the center of what moves you in academia, then you're in for a really hard life, because virtually the vast majority of the external uh, reinforcement you're going to get in academia is negative. Like 9 out of 10 times, regardless of what you're doing, you're going to get a negative external reinforcement from the world. And if that's your primary motivation, you're going to be really down, and right, all the time, right? And you get like, one acceptance a year and you feel great for a day, but then you get nine anyway. So you get the picture. Yeah.
Yeah, and to comment on more specifically your work, I know that you have been doing some work on AI.
Mhm.
What do you see in philosophy and AI these days? That's a really big question, but and so number one, number two, what are you bringing to the table in talking about the AI issues on any number? Maybe that's, philosophy of mind, maybe that's ethics, but
Mhm.
what sort of motivates you to speak into this now very trendy and I think relevant topic?
Well, AI is changing the world rapidly, right? I mean, it's obviously changing higher education, and we're figuring out how to deal with that as instructors and as institutions. And I don't know if anyone has any great answers right now. I'm on a sort of teaching philosophy group on Facebook or whatever, and virtually like all of the posts are like, "How do I deal with AI? Is this a good strategy?" And then everyone's saying all the reasons that it won't work. Um, but my main interest in it is, I mean, I'm interested in it for its own sake, but um, I I'll say, welcoming a daughter into the world, right? Is very important to me that her life be a, a world in which she can live and flourish, right? And I think that my own sense is that AI development is moving much more quickly than an understanding of AI safety and regulation. And there have been all sorts of discussions about how dangerous that is, and well-positioned people who are considered much greater experts on the topic than me warning about the dangerous path that AI development is currently on. And I just published a paper where I claim to give a proof that none of the prevailing AI safety paradigm is viable, right? This idea that we can reliably interpret what large language models are learning and then like align their behavior with human values. And that's sort of the central idea of a lot of AI safety research and development. And I argue that we can't expect that research program to succeed. We can't program AI to be safe. They're always going to be, at least with large language models, going to be radically unpredictable. And in fact, Ilya Sutskever, who was with, I think, OpenAI and is considered a leading figure in the field, just said that at a talk the other day, this big AI convention, like super intelligence, if and when they come into existence, are going to be radically unpredictable, he says. And that's not too bad if they only want rights and to coexist with us. But I think there's a lot of reasons to think that they might not do that. So I'm worried, and I'm worried in part because my daughter was just born, and the future is going to be AI in one way or another, and it's important to me to try to make whatever contribution I can that I think is correct, and to helping to realize a safe future. But yeah.
That I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, it's interesting to hear someone who brings a different perspective, given sort of the lived experience of becoming a parent. It's hard for me to think specifically philosophically about that. I mean, I have my own thoughts on that, but it's not uncommon for someone to, let's say, understand their own philosophical projects in a different way, pre-parent,
Yeah.
post-parent. I mean, that resonates with me completely.
Mm-hmm.
But I mentioned that because of some of the things that we talked about earlier, where maybe that's not a perspective or view that is, I don't know, talked about or even presented as much as maybe it should be in our field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, right. Um, well, that might be because a lot of people don't have kids. I don't know. Don't have
That's what
kids.
I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, it influences my work in all kinds of ways, in political philosophy too, because what the history of the world has been a history of violence, right? And oppression. And I would like my daughter to live in a world where she doesn't face that, right? Or it faces less of it than people have in the past. And but it's not just I don't just do that for her sake. It's like I want to understand how to hopefully realize a better world for all of our sake, right? And I'm only one voice, but I do my best at it, right? Um,
Yeah, right. Well, and I want to talk about your other project. You have so many projects going on in a good way, but the Substack that you, I think, help run, which is New Work in Philosophy. I remember when you started it too, just being excited, like, oh, if anyone is interested in learning about some of the new work in philosophy that either has come out or is coming out, it's a great one-stop shop for going, what are people working on? And I like, how did that project come about? And it seems like you have this cool vantage point of seeing all this new work come in and getting an understanding of like, what are the trends that people are talking about? I don't know. How do you so how
yeah,
did the project come about, and like how are you viewing it now that it's, I guess, a couple years into it?
yeah. So I hate to be influenced by like Nike, but like my attitude with a lot of things in life, right, has been like just do it, right? Just do it. Um, there's always going to be naysayers for anything you do. But so what happened is like Barry Maguire, who's at University of Edinburgh, like sent me an email right out of the blue and saying like, look, I know you run the Philosophers Cocoon. Do you know of any place where, philosophers, can, present their work to like a general audience, to the general public? And I was like, I mean, no, not aside from like the Philosophers Magazine, which is like an official like publication. So I was like, I don't know, like, why don't we just make a place like that? Why don't we make a newsletter? And I recently learned about Substack and thought it was kind of a cool platform. I was like, let's just do it. And so we did. And, he started reaching out to some people to see if they'd be willing to contribute like a video. And so we started out with some pretty neat videos from people like Mark Schroeder at USC. And so that kind of like, gave some initial veneer of legitimacy to the project. And then other people sort of got interested. And part of it was just do it. But also I was like, it is frustrating to be a philosopher and to realize that, like, for the most part, the only people reading your work is this like very small group of people who all have PhDs and are all part of the same world. There's so much cool philosophical work that's been doing. The public should know about it because, of course, like also with the trends in higher education away from the humanities, or, even going all the way back to the time of Thales in ancient Greece, philosophy has always been kind of denigrated, right? I mean, like Thales, was like made fun of by his fellow Athenians for like falling into holes because he was like staring at the sky, thinking through problems. And he was just like going to he gave everyone the big FU by like buying all of the olive presses one year and making a fortune off of olive oil. And he's saying like, look, right, I can make a fortune doing this, but I just choose to do philosophy. And so the point is like people tend to think philosophy is useless. And, there was a recent Daily News discussion. I don't remember exactly what it was about, but it was about like, if there was one thing you had to take away from philosophy and tell the public or something, like what would it be? And it's like all of our lives and all of our societies are in one way or another based upon a philosophy, an implicit philosophy, right? About like what the good is, like what you should be, what are you aiming for in life, right? What do you think happiness is? What do you think a just society is? I mean, these are the things that motivate who we vote for. They're what organize society's constitutions. Philosophy is useful. It does make a difference all over every day and everything that people do in one way or another. We should get it out to the public in whatever way we reasonably can. And so, what the site tries to do is make complex philosophy digestible in a way that is like, accessible to the general public, but also not dumbed down, right? Because like one of the things that frustrates me, and I think a lot of academics about like public intellectuals, right, or like pop scientists, is like usually like the pop science books or the pop philosophy books are kind of like not that good because one of the things I've heard is like when you publish a book for the general audience, publishers don't like all of the uncertainty and qualifications. They like all of the like, here's the truth, and all of the overstatements, selling it as hard as you can. And so when you read a lot of pop philosophy and science, you think, oh, all this string theory stuff is a bunch of garbage, but like the book's presented as though it's unreservedly true. And I think that's a bad aspect of pop philosophy and science. And so like part of what I think is cool about the New Work in Philosophy site is like it presents like good, legit philosophy, but in a way that can hopefully get through to the public. And it's been doing well. It keeps continuing to grow, but yeah, it's cool, and take it as far as it can go, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I mean, you're obviously speaking my language. I mean, part of the entire motivation for doing this Selling Plato project is to try and do some public philosophy in a way that is actually accessible and yet retains the quality of the philosophy that is being presented as well.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I'm only a few months in and sort of just starting it, but I'm wondering, I was going to ask you about that anyway, just in terms of public philosophy. You explained a little bit of it already, but I it's so tricky to find that balance between not coming at this thing with jargon where it's
Mhm.
over people's heads, but not watering it down so that, again, it doesn't retain any sort of consistency with the actual philosophy that
Mhm.
that it's borrowing from. Do you have any sort of ways of understanding that balance, positive experiences, successes from your experience that, let's say, I can take away? I mean, I just wrote this newsletter, I think it was like a couple weeks ago, and on my worst days, I think of philosophy, trying to do public philosophy as sort of interrupting people's ordinary life circumstances. People are just trying to get by doing their jobs and everything. And I
Right.
think that your point resonates with me so much that people are already quote unquote doing philosophy. They're already making arguments, are already quote unquote using logic and that sort of thing. And I think that's completely right. And that's what I've tried to express in many different ways with the podcast, the newsletter, and other venues. But it's difficult to try to capture someone's or try to get someone to appreciate that point that isn't this interruption in their ordinary life. I don't know. Have you found sort of some successful ways of presenting different topics in the field to a broader public?
Huh, that's a difficult question. I don't know. Um, there's sort of this, catch 22, right? There was actually, I think, just a discussion today or yesterday on Daily News where people were like, the problem is that it seems like, or at least like the public wants, much like our students do, they want firm answers to philosophical questions. It's not fun being told, like, what's the answer to this question? And the answer is, well, there's a gazillion different philosophical answers. Here's the argument for each one. That can be really frustrating because it leaves you feeling like, well, I haven't really learned what I wanted to know, which is the answer to the question. But then, it seems like the books that say Stoicism will change your life and make your life perfect, like a lot of like pop philosophy, it's like, that's not helpful either because it's not, there's a reason why most philosophers are not Stoics, is because, yeah, sure, maybe there's some insightful aspects to the theory, but there's also a lot of criticisms of Stoicism as well. And so it's a real trick, right? And I don't know the right balance for, trying to be sort of philosophically rigorous and, hedge where you should hedge and have confidence where you are justified in a way that that will be digestible to the public and also that publishers will want to publish. It's a very difficult balance to hit. I don't know if I have the answer. Unfortunately, I'm just doing my best.
It's such a huge question. I mean, in one sense, it's impossible to answer, but it's helpful to know just what's your approach, what are your thoughts on it, just speaking very generally. It seems so. I do want to tease your upcoming book if you have time and just give people a sense of what to expect. Timing, when does it come out? Uh, is it at the popular level? And what are you wanting to say in this book?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked about that because I think that the book is entitled "Why It's Okay to Be a Moderate," and it's in Routledge's "Why It's Okay" series, and I think it's a really cool series because it aims to sort of straddle the that balance in I think a good way. Is that the series publishes, I think, rigorous but philosophically rigorous books, but in a way that does make the content digestible to a general public. And I really tried to do both aspects well. It engages with a lot of history. I talk about a lot of historical periods in the 20th century and before. It engages with a lot of science and science of like polarization and extremism, and also what enables people to persuade people to share their political values. And so it aims to blend science, history, and philosophical argument in a way that's rigorous but simultaneously accessible. And that's what I think I'm optimistic is cool about the book and sort of unique for what I've done thus far in my career. My first two books were like firmly academic, and my parents were always like I couldn't make it through because it was just like way too abstract and complex. And um, so it's exciting to have my first book come out that's more pitched towards the general audience while still doing philosophy, I think, that is rigorous. But so like the basic pitch for the book is it's entitled "Why It's Okay to Be a Moderate." So the thesis, I make this clear, is like it's not why it's awesome or like always the best to be a moderate, right? Or it's also not like why it's never wrong to be a moderate, because I think that like Martin Luther King was like right on when he criticized the white moderate clergy for like saying, hey, your peaceful protests are going too far, right? No, it's like it's not always okay to be a moderate. It's not always best to be a moderate, and it's also not always wrong to be a moderate. When we say that it's okay to be a moderate, what I mean is there are many types of moderates that it's okay to be. And like also which type of moderate it's okay to be is going to depend upon like what moral and political perspective you have. Like so like the final chapter of the book says like, look, if you're a hardcore progressive, here's why you should think it's okay to be a moderate progressive, right? So not a moderate conservative, right? And if you're a moderate conservative, if you're a conservative, here's why you should think it's okay to be a moderate conservative, not say a moderate progressive. And so I'm trying to sell it to as broadly as possible that no matter your reasonable political background, if you're not a total Nazi, regardless of what your sort of broadly reasonable political ideology might be, you have reasons to think that it's okay to be a certain type of moderate. And in fact, even when it comes to the derided sort of centrist moderates, that there's a lot of reasons to think that regardless of whether you're a hardcore progressive or whether you're a hardcore conservative, there are at least some times when it's okay to be a centrist, although there are other times, I argue, that it's not okay to be a centrist. Okay, so again, it's a little bit, there are these kinds of qualifications that you find in a philosophical work, right? It doesn't defend this very simple conclusion that it's like always great to be a moderate. No, it defends a very careful position. But I think it does so in a way that is very accessible, because basically what I do is I work through history and I work through the science. And I basically show that like the worst things in history have tended to occur when extremists on the far right or the far left have basically won without enough moderation. Like when all the moderates go away and when things become extreme in either direction, like in the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, right, in various tyrannies, whether they're communist tyrannies or whether they're fascist tyrannies, there's repeatedly been the same thing. There's polarization into extremes, violence between them, and then some strong man, either on the left or on the right, that promises to clean everything up, and then they end up killing everybody. Like that's how history has gone. And that things have tended to go the best, right? When certain types of moderates and people more on the radical end of the spectrum have engaged in this kind of productive push and pull to try to pull the public in a more, radical direction, but in a way that doesn't give rise to the collapse of democracy and mass violence, right? So talk about civil rights movements, and women's rights movements, and all of these resulted from this very kind of complex interplay between more radical elements and more moderate elements. And things have tended to go best when that occurs, and they've tended to go worst when there aren't enough moderates. And so the argument is moderates aren't necessarily the best, right? Radicals do have an important role to play in pushing or pulling society in one direction or another, but things tend to go best when there's this kind of, and it's a very difficult road to navigate, but when there's this productive tension between more radical and moderate elements of society. And that's the general picture. And I spell out how radicalism has led to a lot of the problems of the 20th century and into the 21st century, and that there's reasons to think that it's at least as okay now to be a moderate as it ever has been, as we see the march of proto-fascism in many parts of the world and doubts about the viability of democracy. And that's in part why I wrote the book, is because I do believe democracy is valuable, and to preserve it, right, and reap its benefits in the best way, that there does need to be a balance between moderation and radicalism.
And this comes out next year.
It comes out in March 2025. I think it goes on pre-sale sometime in February.
Excellent. Dr. Margus Arvan, thank you for coming on. I just have to say, I mentioned earlier that your Philosopher's Cocoon site was, I can't overstate how helpful it was for me. I don't even remember how I found it, but I turned my friends who were in the graduate department at the time onto it and was like, "Hey, are you reading these articles?" And it seemed like every day there was something where I go, "Okay, great. This was so helpful. This was, some answers that I've been looking for." And I should also mention this was I found it around the time of COVID and quarantine. And so there just weren't many opportunities to talk, even with my committee advisors, supervisors, on some of these questions. And so having that as a resource was just such a lifeline. And in addition to that, I think it was, what was it, 22, January 22, somewhere at some APA meeting, I actually got to meet you in person. And I wouldn't expect you to remember, but we were in this sort of
Totally.
like banquet hall. Okay, all right. And getting to talk to you in person about some of the things on the site. And I was right in the thick of the job market search at that time. And obviously, everything that we've talked about was going on internally in my head, but talking to you was just unbelievably helpful. So, wanted to say thank you so much for all your work that you're doing. It means a lot to so many people. I hope that gets through in some of the comments and that sort of thing. I hope you can sleep at night going, you've done a lot of good for a lot of grad students who are going through a lot of the same things that you've been going through too. So thank you.
Thank you, Jared. That's really awesome to hear, and it means a lot to me. It really, really does. Um,
Good.
and it's been awesome talking with you. I do fondly remember our discussions at the APA, and so it's good to finally touch base and chat at length again.